She was 19 years old, and she had been kicked out. Not given notice. Not eased toward the door with apologies. Kicked out, on a Thursday evening in February, with a rucksack she had packed herself because she could see it coming, and a tin biscuit box that held £6.40, every coin she owned, wedged under her arm because there was no room in the rucksack, and she was not leaving without it. She slept in the waiting room of the Calder Bridge bus station that night because it was the one place open all night where nobody asked questions. In the morning, she walked to the West Riding County surplus office with the biscuit box under her arm, and she put £1 on the counter and became the owner of a derelict Pony Express staging station on the old Calder Moor Road, a stone building the county had been trying to clear from its books since 1971. Nobody thought she could do anything with it. 3 months later, working her way through the building from front to back and reaching a room at the rear that the original survey had listed as a tack and saddle store, she pulled aside a section of timberboarding that had been nailed across an interior doorway and found, in the narrow room behind it, something that had been sealed away since 1924. Calder Bridge had not expected this, and neither had anyone who had ever underestimated Nell Tate. If you're the kind of person who finds meaning in stories like this one, about people who started at the very bottom and built something worth standing in, I hope you'll subscribe before we go any further. It costs nothing and keeps this channel going. And tell me where you're watching from today. Drop it in the comments. These stories find people in places I'd never expect, and I love knowing where they land. Nell Tate grew up in the market town of Calder Bridge in the West Riding of Yorkshire, in a terraced house that always smelled of her grandmother's cooking, beef broth on Mondays, bread on Saturday mornings that scented the entire street by 9 o'clock. Her grandmother was named Agnes, and Agnes had lived in that house for 41 years and ran it with the authority of a woman who has invested herself completely in a place. Agnes ironed everything, including tea towels. She kept a record of every household expense in a blue notebook updated every Sunday after dinner. She had opinions about posture, about storing onions, and about knowing exactly how much money you had at any given moment. She communicated these opinions not through speeches but through daily demonstration, and Nell absorbed all of it the way children absorb the habits of the person they love most, without knowing they are doing so until years later when they find themselves ironing a tea towel and understanding, suddenly, why. Nell's mother, Sandra, was Agnes's youngest and had her mother's practical intelligence without her mother's patience for applying it. Sandra was quick and funny and fond of a good time, with a talent for getting into situations that required managing and less talent for the managing. She had come back to Agnes's house when Nell was 2, after a relationship that ended badly, and she had stayed because Agnes did not make conditions on the staying, and because the house was solid and the bread was ready on Saturday mornings. She worked at the council office on and off, and she had a laugh that carried through walls and that Nell, even in the difficult years, could not associate with anything but warmth. What Sandra had by the time Nell was 15 was a man named Derek. Derek was 47, worked in logistics, and had the confidence of a man who has never been seriously wrong because he has never seriously examined his assumptions. He moved into Agnes's house in the spring Nell turned 15, the same spring Agnes's health began to give way in the small accumulating ways that Nell noticed before Sandra did, and Sandra noticed before Derek, who did not occupy himself with other people's health unless it affected his schedule. Derek was not violent. He was something harder to argue against, an atmosphere. He took up space pervasively and without apology, and the space he took was the space where Agnes had been the authority, and was now, slowly, not. When Agnes died, the spring Nell turned 17. A quick heart attack that left a silence in the house, so complete she could hear the kitchen clock for the first time in her life. The authority went with her. Not to Sandra. who grieved in the soft, unfocused way of someone who has lost the scaffolding of her life. To Derek, who had been waiting, not impatiently, for exactly this. He began making decisions that had been Agnes's. He began expressing opinions about who should occupy which rooms. He began to speak about the future of the house in terms that did not include a teenager who was not his daughter. He did not say this directly. He was not that kind of man. What he said at the kitchen table in February of the year Nell turned 19 was that things were getting tight, said to Sandra, not to Nell. Though Nell was sitting directly across from him, he said with Sandra's hours cut and the cost of everything rising, they needed to think about their outgoings. He used the word outgoings. He looked at the table when he said it, not at Nell. Sandra said nothing. She looked at her plate. Nell looked at Derek looking at the table, and she understood. She packed that afternoon while they were both at work. She took everything that was hers, and she took Agnes's blue notebook from the kitchen drawer where Agnes had always kept it, and that nobody had touched since she died, because nobody else had known it was there. She put the biscuit tin in her coat pocket and made herself a cup of tea and drank it at the kitchen window, looking at the small yard where Agnes had kept herb pots until the year she couldn't. Then she rinsed the cup and left it upside down on the rack, and she went. The bus station waiting room was cold. The plastic seats were designed to be uncomfortable for extended sitting, and they succeeded. She sat upright with the rucksack between her feet and opened Agnes's blue notebook and read it from the first entry. January 1963, coal 4.6, bread 1, onions 9D. To the last, a Sunday in March 2 years ago. Electricity and water. And a note that said, check the boiler before cold comes. Nell knows how. She sat with that for a while. Then she looked at the bus station wall, which had a county property notice pinned to it between a timetable and an advertisement for a driving school. She read the notice because there was nothing else to look at. The county was disposing of several surplus properties. A storage depot. A weighing station. And the old Calder Moor Pony Station on the Calder Moor Road. Derelict since closure in 1952, structural survey completed in 1970, listed for disposal since 1971 at a reserve price of £1 with no takers due to outstanding access questions and the costs of bringing the building into compliance. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket beside Agnes's notebook. In the morning she went to the surplus office. She was there when it opened. The surplus officer was a man named Mr. Crossley, who had the look of someone who had been surprised by very little in his professional life and was prepared to continue in that pattern. He pulled the Calder Moor Pony Station file and read her the material facts. Built 1851. Stone construction. Operated as a staging post on the Calder Moor coaching and Pony Express route until 1952. 2 main rooms and a tack store and a small lean-to stable that had partially collapsed on just under half an acre of rough ground abutting the moorland common. Outstanding issues. Access from the Moor Road was across a strip of land whose ownership had been disputed since 1958. No mains water. No mains gas. Electricity via a pole connection that had not been tested in 20 years. He set the file down. He looked at Nell. He said, "You're 19, I am. And you have £1, I do." He looked at the file again. He had the expression of a man in a mild contest between his professional judgment and a quality that did not have an official name in county surplus disposal but might have been described, if pressed, as decency. Decency 1. He said, "There is a solicitor named Mrs. Brooke in the town who handled the access dispute in 1971. She'll know more about the land position than anyone alive. I'd see her before you do anything with the property." He pushed the form across the desk. £1. She signed. She paid. She took the key, a long iron key on a loop of twine, heavy and cold, and she went to find Mrs. Brooke. Mrs. Brooke was 64, recently retired but maintaining 2 clients, and had an office above a stationer's shop on the high street that smelled of paper and the ghost of pipe tobacco from a previous tenant. She looked at Nell across her desk with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has assessed several thousand people across that desk and found it a reliable method. She said the access dispute was solvable. It had not been solved because the county had not been motivated, and the adjacent landowner, a farming family named Outhwaite, had not been asked correctly. She said she would write a letter. She said she would charge Nell the minimum amount her professional standards permitted her to charge, which was £8, and she expected Nell to pay it when she had it. "When will that be?" Nell asked. "I have no idea," Mrs. Brooke said. "That's all right." There was also a man named Roy Sugden who appeared at the pony station on Nell's second visit, coming across the moorland from the direction of the Outhwaite farm, with the purposeful walk of a man who has seen a stranger at a building he has considered his informal responsibility for some time. He was 63, weathered the way people are weathered who work outdoors in Yorkshire for decades, and he had a directness about him that was not unfriendly, but left no room for anything other than the main point. He said, "You've bought the station." "I have." He looked at the building for a moment. The stone's sound. The roof needs 4 courses reslated on the north face. The lean-to is gone. He looked at her. "What are you planning to do with it?" "I'm not entirely certain yet." He nodded as though this was a more reasonable answer than he'd expected. "There's a room at the back they boarded up in the 20s, behind the tack store. The Outhwaites will know why. They've been on that land since before the station was built." He looked at her one more time, measuring, "I'll tell them you're here." The building was worse and better than she had prepared for, in the ways old buildings always are. The lean-to was entirely down, not partially, stones scattered, timber rotted to nothing, the ground a confusion of bramble that would take weeks to clear. The north roof had lost 8 courses, not 4. And the tack store floor beneath the gap was soft underfoot, a season or 2 from rotting through. The electricity connection was dead. But the main walls were magnificent. Millstone grit, dry laid in the old manner, 3 feet thick at the base, absorbing 123 years of West Riding weather, with the equanimity of something that understood from the beginning that weather was the whole of the job. The main room still had its original flagstone floor, every flag in place. The fireplace was intact. The iron range was rusted but structurally whole, and when she opened the flue it was clear, just cold air dropping from the chimney top in a clean column. The tack store was at the rear of the building, accessed through a low door off the main room. It was roughly 12 feet by 10, the walls of unplastered stone, a single north-facing window, and at the far end of the tack store, where you would expect another wall, there was instead a section of timber boarding, 6-inch planks, tongue and grooved, nailed across what was clearly an interior doorway. The boarding was old. It had been painted over at least twice, the paint now yellowed and cracking at the joins. The door frame behind it was still visible at the top and sides. The original stone surround, the lintel a single piece of gritstone, solid. She stood in the tack store with her hand on the boarding, and she thought about what Roy Sugden had said. They boarded it up in the 20s. She did not try to open it that day. She stood with her hand on the boarding, and she listened, though what she was listening for she could not have said. And then she took her hand away and went back to the main room and sat on the flagstone floor with her back to the wall and Agnes's notebook in her lap. And she thought about where she was and what she had and what came next. What came next was 2 months of work. She was living in the main room by the end of the first week, sleeping bag on the flags, rucksack against the wall. The iron range burning timber she collected from the fallen lean until she could source coal. The electricity pole, she discovered with the help of a man from the board who came out on her 3rd day, needed a new connection from the pole to the building, which was a job the board would do at their own schedule, which turned out to be 6 weeks. For 6 weeks she used candles and a gas camping lantern and the range, which was enough. Roy Sugden came by on the 4th day with a load of slate in the back of a Land Rover and 2 men from the Outhwaite farm who said nothing but worked steadily and without instruction for 4 hours and left the north roof face slated and sound and would not take money for it. Nell fed them lunch from what she had, which was soup and bread, and Roy said the soup was good and the younger of the 2 men nodded, and she understood this was the West Riding's form of high praise. Mrs. Brooke wrote the letter to the Outhwaites about the access strip. And the Outhwaites, who turned out to be a family of 5 siblings now in their 60s and 70s who had been squabbling about the strip between themselves since 1958, without resolution, and who were quietly relieved to have the matter taken out of their hands, agreed to a formal right-of-way that Mrs. Brooke registered with the county before the end of March. The building, with each thing fixed, became more itself. That was the only way Nell could describe it. The main room with the flagstone floor and the range going and the candles in the evenings was a room that had been used for 2 hours a day as a staging post by cold and tired people for 100 years, and it had the solidity of something that understood its purpose and had been waiting to return to it. She worked during the days and read Agnes's notebook in the evenings and went to bed early, because the West Riding in February goes dark at 4:30, and there is nothing to do about it except accept it. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late April, after the electricity was finally connected and she had a proper light to work by, that she went back to the tack store with a crowbar. She had been saving it. She knew this about herself, that she had been deliberately deferring the boarding because the building had not been ready, and she had not been ready, and she had wanted both of those things to be true before she opened what was behind it. The roof was sound. The access was legal. The range was drawing properly. She was ready. The boarding came away more easily than she expected. The nails were old and had lost their grip, and with the crowbar behind the first plank it came free with a sound like a seal breaking. And then the next. And then they came quickly. Behind them was the door, original, heavy, with iron strap hinges and an iron latch, still set in its frame. Closed, not locked. The lock had no key in it, and when she pressed the latch it lifted. She pushed the door open. Right before we find out what was inside that room, thank you for being here this far into the story. Honestly, if you aren't subscribed yet, now is the moment. This is exactly what the channel is for, and what's behind this door is worth staying for. Back to Caldermore Road. The saddle room was roughly 8 feet by 12, narrower than the tack store, the ceiling lower. The walls were lime-washed, and the lime-wash had gone cream with age and had a quality of preserved stillness, the way lime-washed rooms do when they have been sealed from weather. The floor was flagstone, like the main room, clean dust settled, but not broken. The room smelled of old leather and something beneath it that was dry and mineral, and which she later understood was the smell of paper stored properly in a dry space for a very long time. Along the left wall were the original saddle brackets, iron. Wall-mounted, 4 of them, empty. Along the right wall was a wooden cabinet, roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, built into the wall rather than placed against it, with 2 doors and a simple wooden turn-button closure. And in the corner, on the floor beneath the cabinet, was a tin trunk, the kind with a domed lid and a hasp clasp, painted black. The paint worn at the corners and edges to show the tin beneath. She opened the cabinet first. Inside, on 3 shelves, were tins of saddle soap, old, still sealed. The labels printed in a typeface that she would later learn was characteristic of a manufacturer that had ceased trading in 1931. 18 tins, arranged in rows of 6, as precise as the day they were placed. Below the tins, on the lowest shelf, a leather-wrapped parcel tied with household string that had gone the color of old straw. She lifted it out and unwrapped it. Inside was a bridle, complete, supple, the leather dark with oil and as preserved as the day it was last cleaned. The metalwork was silver, not plate, solid silver, she confirmed by the hallmark when she looked, and the silverwork was engraved, a pattern of running ponies around the cheek pieces, fine and precise, the kind of engraving that is not decorative, but meaningful. Made to commemorate something specific. She held it in both hands in the dim room and turned it in the light from the doorway and looked at the ponies running around and around. And she thought about what it meant for something this well made to be put in a cabinet in a sealed room in 1924 and left. The tin trunk took both hands. It was not padlocked. The Hesp clasp was stiff with disuse, but gave way without force. The lid came up on hinges that protested once and then held. Inside were papers. A great many papers, organized by year in bundles tied with faded ribbon. The kind of organization that comes from someone who understood that papers left in disorder are papers eventually lost. The earliest bundles were from the 1890s, the latest from 1923. Beneath the papers at the bottom of the trunk, a brown envelope sealed with wax. The wax impressed with a mark she recognized as a compass rose, and on the front of the envelope, in a handwriting that had the upright certainty of someone who was confident their letter would be read. For whoever opens this room properly. She carried the envelope to the main room and set it on the floor beside the range, and she made a cup of tea, and she sat down, and she opened it. The letter was from a man named Thomas Calder. She learned this from the signature at the bottom, who had been the last proprietor of the Calder Moor Pony Station before its closure in 1924, when the motor road made the staging post redundant. He had written the letter in October of that year, 3 months before the station formally closed, in the clear and deliberate hand of a man in his 60s who had been using that hand to record things precisely for 40 years. He wrote that he was sealing the saddle room because he could not bring himself to sell its contents and could not take them with him, and because what was in it had belonged to the station and should stay with the station. He wrote that the bridle was the one made for the last of the Calder ponies, a gray mare named Patience, who had worked the Moor route for 12 years and who had been the best of them, and that the silverwork had been done by a craftsman in Halifax as a record of what good work a pony and a person can do together over time. He wrote that the papers in the trunk were the station's full records, every transit logged, every payment received, every name of every rider, and every pony across 40 years of operation, and that he was leaving them because the history of the Moor route should not be lost, and he did not know who else to give it to. And then he wrote what Nell read 3 times before she understood it, and once more after that to be sure. He wrote that the station had been profitable for most of its 40 years, that he had lived simply and saved accordingly, and that what he had saved was held in a bank account whose details were enclosed on a separate sheet. He had no children. His wife had died in 1919. He had decided, after long consideration, that the money should belong to whoever found the letter, because whoever found the letter would be the person who had taken the station seriously enough to open a sealed room rather than simply ignoring it, and that was the only qualification he had been able to think of that actually mattered. He wrote, "I want the money to go to someone who respects the place it came from. I think that is the fairest test I can devise." The separate sheet had the bank details. The account had been held in trust by a solicitor in Halifax, whose firm, after some searching, Nell discovered had been absorbed into a larger practice still operating in the city. The account, maintained in trust through successive custodians for 50 years since Thomas Calder's death in 1931, held £742. It had earned interest. The current total, when the Halifax solicitor's successor, a careful young man named Mr. Park, who found the whole situation professionally extraordinary and tried not to show it, completed his calculation, was £4,386.14. She sat with that figure in Mrs. Brooks' office. Where she had gone the same afternoon, she found the letter, because Mrs. Brooke was the only person she knew who could tell her what it meant legally. Mrs. Brooke read the letter and the separate sheet and the papers she had brought from the trunk without speaking for 12 minutes. Then she looked up. "This is valid," she said. "I thought it might be. It's unusual, but it's valid." She looked at the letter again. He was thorough. She said it in the tone she reserved for things she approved of. "You'll need to go to Halifax. I'll write to Mr. Park this week." The bridle went to the Tolson Museum in Huddersfield on long-term loan, not permanently, because Nell felt it belonged at the station and intended it to come back eventually, but the museum could conserve it properly and display it where people could see it, and that seemed right in the short term. The museum's curator, a woman named Dr. Frances Heap, who had spent 20 years researching the West Riding's inland transport history, and who arrived at the pony station on a Tuesday morning with barely suppressed delight, identified the silverwork as the work of a Halifax craftsman named Bottomley, who had produced perhaps a dozen such pieces between 1910 and 1925, of which only 3 were known to survive. She said this twice, in slightly different words, the way people repeat things when they are trying to make sure the import is not lost. Nell said, "I understood the first time." "Doctor," Heap laughed. She liked Nell immediately. The records in the trunk, 40 years of transit logs, payment registers, and rider lists, went to the West Riding Archive at Wakefield, where they were catalogued over a year and where Dr. Heap eventually co-authored a paper about them that drew notice in the field of transport history and brought the name Thomas Calder into print for the first time in half a century. Roy Sugden came to see her the week after she told him what she'd found. He sat in the main room on the chairs she'd acquired from a house clearance, and he read Thomas Calder's letter and looked at the photographic copies of the silver bridle that Dr. Heap had left with her. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The Outhwaites will know. About Patience. The pony? The gray mare. Thomas Calder's family and the Outhwaites went back generations on that moor." He handed the letter back. "I'll ask." He came back 2 days later with a piece of information delivered with the economy of a man who has confirmed something he already suspected. He said the oldest of the Outhwaite siblings, a woman of 78 named Edna, who had not left the farm in 3 years, but who remembered everything, had told him that Thomas Calder used to bring Patience to the Outhwaite yard after every season, in the autumn, and he used to let any child on the farm ride her around the yard for as long as they liked. He did not ask permission from the parents. He did not announce it. He simply brought the pony and let the children ride and took her home again when they were done. And he did this every autumn for 12 years until Patience was too old for the moor route and was retired to a field, and then he brought her anyway, because the children expected it. "Every autumn," Nell said. "Every autumn." Roy looked at the range. Edna said she was 5 the first time. She said she remembered the color of the pony and the way the mane felt, and that she had not thought about it in 60 years, and now she couldn't stop. Nell sat with that for a moment. She thought about Thomas Calder bringing a gray mare to a farmyard every autumn for 12 years, because the children expected it. She thought about a man who sealed a room and left a letter for someone he had never met and could not describe except by what they would do. She thought about Agnes's blue notebook and the cost of coal in January 1963, and the note that said Nell knows how to check the boiler. In the autumn of the first year, she borrowed Roy Sugden's daughter's pony, a stocky dun named Ted, who had the mild, cooperative temperament of an animal that has dealt with beginners before and has made his peace with it. And she brought him to the Outhwaite yard on a Saturday morning, and she let every child on the farm ride him around the yard for as long as they liked. She did not announce it. She simply came with the pony and let the children ride. Edna Outhwaite watched from the farmhouse window and said nothing. But Roy told Nell later that Edna had cried, which Roy reported in the tone of a man for whom this was significant and private information, and Nell received it in the same spirit. She did it the following autumn. She did it every autumn after that. The money from Thomas Calder's account, £4,386.14, went toward the station's proper restoration. Not renovation, not modernization. Restoration, the original materials, the original methods where possible. The building put back to what it had been, rather than converted to something it wasn't. Roy Sugden supervised most of it. The Outhwaite family contributed labor on 2 Saturdays in a spirit of involvement that was also, Nell understood, their way of expressing something they would not say directly. Mrs. Brooke waived her final invoice on the grounds that the case had been more interesting than most things she had handled in 40 years of practice, and she said so plainly, without embarrassment. Sandra called in June. Derek had said nothing to her about calling. She was clear about that, in a way that told Nell he didn't know, and that this mattered to her. She said she had heard from a woman at the council office who had heard from someone in the county property department, which was the way things traveled in Calder Bridge. She said it sounded like Nell had done something remarkable. She said it in a voice that carried everything she hadn't said in February, and Nell heard all of it. "Are you all right, Mum?" Nell asked. A long pause. "I'm thinking about it," Sandra said. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. Nell understood that it was a beginning. They talked for 40 minutes. Sandra said she missed Agnes. Nell said she did too. Sandra said the window box had geraniums in it again. She had planted them herself that week, the first time since Agnes died. Nell said she thought she understood why it had taken so long, and she meant it. Derek called 3 days later. His voice had the quality of a man who has been rehearsing something and is now delivering it slightly differently than rehearsed. He said he'd heard about the station. He said it was quite a thing to have found. He said, "I didn't think you had it in you." He paused. I was wrong." He said it in the flat, slightly pained way of a man who has had to say a thing he has never said before and is not comfortable in the saying of it. "I know," Nell said. She did not offer anything more, not reassurance, not the release of warmth that would have made the moment easier for him. She simply said she had to get back to work, and she meant it, and she went. The station opened to visitors in the second year, not formally, but to anyone who asked. Dr. Heap brought students. The West Riding Local History Society came on a Saturday in October. A group of children from the primary school came in November, and one of them asked where the pony was, and Nell said there would be one in the yard come autumn, and they could come back and ride it. They did. The bridle came back from the Tolson in the 4th year. Dr. Heap brought it herself, wrapped in archival tissue, and fitted it into the display case Nell had built into the saddle room wall and stepped back and said nothing, which was its own form of satisfaction. Agnes's blue notebook was on the shelf in the main room, beside the 3 volumes of local history Dory had given her over the years, which Nell had carried in the rucksack, and which had been the first books on the first shelf in every place she had lived since. She updated the notebook on Sunday evenings, not household expenses, not precisely, but what Agnes had actually been recording, which was the state of things, what was needed, what had been done, what was coming, what was certain, what was not. The first entry she had made in it herself, in the bus station waiting room on the night she had been kicked out, was 3 words: £1. Purpose unknown. She crossed out purpose unknown in the 4th year. She left the rest. She was 19 years old, and she had been kicked out. She owned a rucksack, a biscuit tin, £6.40, and a blue notebook that told her to check the boiler, and that the person who had loved her most had trusted her with it. She spent one of those pounds on a derelict pony station on the Calder Moor Road, and she went into the sealed room when she was ready. And what she found there had been waiting 50 years for the right person to find it, not by searching, not by luck, but by taking the station seriously enough to open a boarded door properly, instead of walking past it. What Thomas Calder understood, and what Nell came to understand, is that the things worth inheriting are never left to the obvious people. They are left to the careful ones. The ones who check what needs checking and fix what needs fixing, and do not open a door until the room behind them is ready for what the door might reveal. The world is full of boarded rooms. Most people walk past. The ones who stop and listen to the wall and come back when they are ready, those are the ones the rooms were waiting for. She was 19 and kicked out. She had £1. She spent it on a building at the end of a moor road, and she opened the saddle room when she was ready, and what was inside it had been left for exactly the person she had already spent her life becoming. Thank you for being here all the way to the end of this one. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone who trusted you with something before you knew you were ready for it, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope today is the day. My question for this week, and I mean it genuinely, has there ever been someone in your life who trusted you with something, a responsibility, a task, a piece of knowledge, before you felt ready, and who turned out to be right? I'd love to read your answer in the comments. Those are the ones that stay with me. See you in the next one.